the Toronto Star. I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. Black Lives Matter. It's more than 3 words. It's about having uncomfortable conversations, accountability, and real change. It's often suggested that Black Canadians don't have the same systemic problem as the US with racial discrimination. But the data says something different. Black Canadians account for 3.5% of the country's total population, but they are disproportionately overrepresented in the prison systems. A Black person is 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the Toronto police. And all this while we saw the coronavirus stalking Black bodies, killing disproportionately. As we enter Black History Month, there are still too many who only recognize Black history during this one month and ignore it for the rest of the year. Inspired by this summer's Black Lives Matter resurgence, 4 Black teachers at a Toronto high school came up with a unique course on anti-Black racism to ensure that learning is ongoing. Toronto Star reporter Angelyn Francis covered this story and joins me now to take us through it, and why we need to keep talking about anti-Black racism in Canada. Hi, Angelyn. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.
So, 4 Black high school teachers decided to take matters into their own hands and fill gaps on anti-racism, and they made a whole new course that's never been taught. How did this happen? And did the students have some kind of a role to play as well?
Yeah, so this happened last June, around the time when George Floyd was killed by police in the States, and that video circulating. Obviously, teenagers are on social media constantly, so students at their school had been seeing the clip and seeing conversations about it. So that was how the course kind of came about. Some students were a little bit concerned about the ways some of their peers were talking about his death and brought it to school administration. And then they started having a bit of like a roundtable and a town hall kind of to talk about like, okay, well, what can we do about this as Newton Brook Secondary School? And so these 4 teachers, when they left that roundtable and started talking amongst themselves, they said, well, we should do more than just a roundtable. So they said, why don't we create a course? Why don't we come up with this course? We want it to be taught this upcoming year, which is usually tricky because students pick their courses from like wintertime. They wanted to be able to draft it over the summer. They wanted to be able to have it be supported by schools so that they would be paid to do it and then teach it the upcoming year. And when they brought that to their administration, they said, okay, they got to go ahead in a matter of days. And it got underway really quickly from there.
Right. And what's this course about? What does it teach exactly?
So what they were thinking was they wanted to figure out a way to help students have more knowledge about these kinds of conversations, because they were thinking that like ignorance when it comes to race and something like what happened to George Floyd and Black people in general, that kind of just comes from a lack of understanding. So they wanted to give students a class where they could learn the language, where they could learn about the history of how Black people are treated in North America and around the world, where they could interrogate what media representation looks like what they've been absorbing in terms of stereotypes and things all these years, and then really think about what it is that they could do to try and change the way people view Black people. And then they wanted to give them a chance to think about what things that they could do to make a difference in the world.
Right. And I've read your piece, and it's talking about some of the classes in session, and you're talking about noisy debates and, certain topics that are talked about. Tell me, what does a typical class session look like?
Yeah, it was funny. I was talking to Tiffany Barrett. It's a teacher. She normally teaches French and history at Newton Brook, and she was teaching this course. And especially since it came together so quickly, there were 10 students who dropped a course that they'd already signed up for in order to take this one. So 10 students, it's a bit of a small group. It's also online, but she was telling me that sometimes she'll be teaching and maybe her sister will be home as well, walk by her door and hear it sound like a 4th grade classroom. She just kind of opens the door and the speakers are on. She says, "Are you okay? Are you sure you're alone in here? We're not supposed to have anybody over." And it sounds like it's just a really engaged, rambunctious, or not rambunctious even, but really engaged and really invested in the topics. Like she mentioned something when they talk about maybe a local story of somebody who died recently. The students will be like, well, so what are we going to do about it, miss? Like they're really invigorated.
Very direct questions, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. She's like, well, we're still figuring it. She's like, I don't even know what the answer to that is, but what would you like to do about it? It sounds like it's a mix of students too. Like there are some who are really gung-ho about that. 5 of the students that are taking it right now are Black and 5 aren't. So for the Black students, they're sharing some of their own personal experiences and being nervous about applying for jobs sometimes, like not wanting to go in person because they think like, oh, once they see that I'm Black, this may not go over so well. And other people really just wanting to try and be better allies and learn a little bit more about their peers' experience and in some ways even relate to it themselves if they're also people of color. It sounds like it's a lot of students who are really like seeking to make a difference in their communities and trying to learn as much as they can about these issues and seem really happy to be able to have it and have somebody older, like a teacher, guide them through all these conversations that they normally just have on social media.
Right. And Angelyn, what I find very unique about this course is that it combines history and context with a sense of agency, right? You're talking about how students are looking at ways that they can actually use what they have, spoken about to create change in the system. So there's this whole holistic approach, which is very innovative. I think it's academic and also action oriented, right?
Yeah. And because I was talking to it was 4 teachers who are involved in this. So I'm getting a lot of like the TDSB kind of lingo, like all the lesson plan things that I was never privy to when I was a student. But it's one of those courses that's a little bit more interdisciplinary. And it's not about memorizing all of these facts, dates, and topics, but it's more so about understanding it and being able to apply it and actually go out and take the things that they learned in class and see how it applies to the world around them and how they can use it to influence things that they come across. So there's a whole unit where they're meant to kind of be members of the community. Like, are you going to volunteer for an organization? Are you going to write a letter to a politician? Or it gets them more engaged in bringing the things they're talking about in the classroom into the real world, which I think is really cool. And it seems like one of the best ways to really measure how well you absorb everything that we talked about this semester. And they definitely talk about the fact that Miss Barrett anyway, has talked about how they don't always necessarily agree on certain things and not all of the students necessarily want to be out there in the streets and protesting, but then she is able to share with them other ways of having an impact. You can write a letter, you can email people, you can sign petitions. Like you don't always need to be out there physically if that's maybe not your personality.
And tell me a little bit more about the students. You mentioned it's a mix of Black and non-Black students. How are they feeling about all of this? How are they responding? You mentioned in your piece that there's been open debates on difficult topics during class. Are Black and racialized students also sharing their personal experiences with racism as well? Because for them, systemic racism, it's not just academic. It's a part of their everyday life. So is that kind of sharing happening? That must be quite a difficult class to be a part of, right?
Yeah, for sure. I didn't get to sit in on a class, but I heard a lot of stories from both the guidance counselors. One of them read out a letter from the guidance counselor. So since this is the first time the class is running, the vice principals at Newton Brook were collecting feedback from students. And I wish I could remember word for word what one of them said. But when I was interviewing Remy Basu, who works in the guidance department and kind of was going through all these letters, she got teary-eyed reading one of the emails from a student. And the student, she was an ally, so I don't think she was Black, but she was just expressing how different the course was from anything she's ever taken in the school and how much she was able to take away from it and learn. And there's also a unit for sure that is just about oppression and being marginalized in general. So that's when they connect the kinds of things that Black people have had to deal with racism to other forms of oppression that other racialized groups may face and that other people who maybe are LGBTQ or women and other forms of oppression as well. So there's a lot of bridging that's happening and a lot of bridging between identities and between how this can relate to your world in general.
We'll be right back. Did you speak to some of these teachers about how important it is to have more Black-focused content with Black Canadian perspectives? And did they talk about whether the current education system is inadequate when it comes to preparing young kids to have conversations about this kind of stuff, to address issues of race and white supremacy?
Oh, yeah. The project lead, D. Tyler Robinson, pretty much said exactly that there really aren't courses like this that equip students to be able to talk about these things. And they're things that you learn without really trying. Like from a young age, kids are able to distinguish race, and they're able to distinguish who their parents are friends with and who looks like them and who doesn't. And then messaging comes in as they go along through media and through the conversations that they have about what that difference means. And all of this is things that kids are learning without much guidance, because for me and for students even in this generation, there aren't courses that are about it. They're all very much focused on learning math and learning English and learning science and learning those core concepts. And you never really learn about taxes. And then you never really learn how to talk about racism or how to read an article and figure out if the headline is biased or not. But you don't really learn about those things. I know for sure when I was in school, we definitely learned about Black people and slavery in a very American context, not at all in a Canadian context, really. And I think even this summer, too, the fact that George Floyd was the real trigger for this conversation, and he, again, was American, we had a number of stories in Canada that had very similar lines to it.
We have a 400-year-old, very dark history, actually. And I was looking into this, and there's a number of other campaigns, too, challenging how little of Canadian Black history is part of the curriculum in Canada, right? I was reading the Ontario Black History Society recently called it out as well. And you can't address anti-Black racism without acknowledging this and without acknowledging the Canadian narrative, like you said. And you're talking about your experience and the experience of many, where there's a systemic sort of exclusion and a sense of erasure of the Black Canadian history or the Black Canadian experience. Did you have a sense of that growing up and studying here at some point?
Yeah, that for sure. I didn't learn a lot about history beyond the War of 1812, beyond settling the West. And even then, they didn't even mention treaties that were signed with Indigenous people. Somehow we managed to just expand all the way to British Columbia without ever coming upon any obstacles. But history is taught in such a condensed way. And I think that's often used as reasoning for it, that there's only so much that we could fit into a semester or into a unit. But you're always making choices with that, because it's not to say that history doesn't exist. I think the only time I really learned about anything in a Canadian context was I just so happened to pick up a novel about Africville. I just so happened to read about Viola Desmond, and not until I was maybe 15. I just kind of happened to stumble upon these things and maybe learn a little bit more about it in university when I had the chance to make course picks based on my own interests. And even then, it's optional. Like, I really remember when I was taking an English class in university that the professor happened to be a Black woman, and she made choices about the books that we read. And we read things that were written by Indigenous authors, and about Japanese internment camps, and about Trinidad. There was Shakespeare. We had to read The Tempest, but then we also read a modern adaptation that was set in the Caribbean. So she chose all of these pieces that were very diverse and very different from what I used to read in an English class. And it was a mandatory class too. And I remember being so astonished by the fact that a lot of students were going to be reading these books now who may not have come across them in their everyday life or not have sought out a course like this.
So what's next for this brand new course? Are there any plans to take this to other schools or try to officially introduce this to the Ontario education curriculum? Because it seems like that should potentially be happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really impressed with how much groundwork these teachers have been doing in addition to just regular teaching. Or in the case of one of them, he's on parental leave, so raising a new baby.
Wow. Okay. That's a lot.
I know, right? So they all started out at the same school at Newton Brook Secondary, but two of them were sent to two different high schools because of the pandemic, since they were trying to balance out the need of teachers. Two of them got sent to new schools, and one of them was C.W. Jeffries. So they're in talks to be teaching it next semester, as well as 4 other schools at least. Teachers who created this course have just kind of been promoting it and trying to getting in front of administration at different schools and their trends at other schools so that they can take this ready-made curriculum. And they're definitely not precious about it. They know that there can be improvements made. So they're kind of like open to workshopping it too with other teachers. But yeah, they're just trying to promote it as much as possible, trying to get it to other schools in the TDSB. And they're also trying to get it across Ontario. So they ultimately want the Ministry of Education to be in charge of making sure that this is taught across schools.
And what are some of the challenges to these plans that they might be facing? I'm guessing that this is the kind of course that you need Black teachers to teach. And are there enough Black teachers in the education system?
That's $1 million question. Yeah, that's definitely something. Remy Basu told me that was some of the feedback they got from students. That students for sure say that we want to be taught this by a Black teacher. Like, this just makes sense to us. So that's feedback they got from students. They don't disagree with it at all. So when it's being taught at other schools, there are definitely some schools in the TDSB that may not have a Black teacher at all. So what does that then mean? Does that mean you're going to work to have a teacher transferred in who can teach the curriculum? Are you going to take that into consideration with hiring and make sure that your next hire is a Black teacher, a teacher who also has a background in history as well, since that's kind of what the faculty that this course falls under? So there's all those considerations. And then there's also trying to even get it past admin in terms of for schools where there may not be a very big Black population or a very big racialized population. Sometimes you meet like a really enthusiastic, oh yeah, for sure, we're going to put it here. And then sometimes you meet well, do we really need it if we don't have Black students? And from the talks with the teachers and the students and with some admin and even just my own opinion, I could definitely see it being just a mandatory course for anybody, regardless of your race.
Everybody needs to learn about anti-racism. So I would say I agree with you as well. And what I've noticed, Angelyn, in Canada is compared to the US, we don't really acknowledge this stuff overtly, that systemic racism exists here as well. We like to think that we're better here, and perhaps in certain ways we might be, but it all kind of comes down to the degree of expression and the level of violence when it comes to the treatment of Black people and other racialized communities. So it feels like there is a conversation now unfolding. Do you feel like this anti-racism reckoning is now happening in the academic field finally as well?
Oh, yeah, I think it for sure has been happening across so many different sectors. I keep coming across people in the charity sector, like the philanthropic sector, in schools and business. Like, this was, for some reason, the very crucial point where everybody kind of said, enough is enough, we have to talk about this. I have definitely seen it. It's been a conversation in Canada just as much as it has been in the States, which I find really unique for all those reasons that you just said. We tend to forget about the fact that these things happen in Canada, or it happens in such a way that's kind of covert, kind of quiet, kind of friendly. But people are finally waking up and saying that this is here. We're not unique and we're not spectacularly special, that we're exempt from having these kinds of biases or playing into racism. And we need to actually acknowledge it and actually try to do things to make it different.
And importantly, we're having very direct, very personal conversations about it. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight, Angelyn, and stay safe.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
That was the Star's Local Journalism Initiative reporter, Angelyn Francis. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabai Tazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Muther. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.